Uh, my book, Love and Loss, latest book, came out in 2006, is about the roots of grief as they were revealed by patients seeking psychiatric help from me. I developed a questionnaire, which I'll tell you a bit more about, to measure the kinds of attachment they had with their own parents and subsequent consequences in adult life. And whilst I don't have time today to go into this in detail, I'd like to say a little bit more about the special problems arising from attachments. John Bowlby, in his initial work, was focusing very much on the effects on young children of separation from their parents. And he demonstrated and reviewed a very large literature showing how often separations from parents in childhood predict insecurity and other problems later. In my own studies of bereaved psychiatric patients, I've used a separation score. I asked people questions about both parents, if they were separated from them, how often, how long, that kind of thing, as a result of which they got a separation score. And I found my separation score statistically correlating with self-assessments of being unhappy as a child, using, again, various measures of unhappiness. In adult life, their relationships tended to be very conflicted. And when I looked at the case notes, it seemed to me that there were two major causes of this. On the one hand, there were people who were wary of getting too attached for fear that they would lose the person they were attached to. So they were giving out mixed messages. They desperately wanted to get attached, but they were afraid to. So they would come close and then back off. And that complicated the relationship. There were others who somehow never quite succeeded in separating from their own parents. There was a sort of clinging attachment to the parents. If they did cling to their partner, very often the partner couldn't stand being clung to. So whilst it's easy to understand why children who've had a lot of separations from their parents tend to cling, it's paradoxical that the clinging, which is intended to stop separations, may actually have the exact opposite effect of causing more separations, because the partner then leaves you. The word end of tether is something which is a lay term, which is not used by psychiatrists, but I found it very useful, because everybody knows what you mean when you say, what do you do when you get to the end of your tether? And I developed a questionnaire, a multiple choice question, where people could say, yes, well, if I get to the end of my tether, I call up my brother, or I go to the doctor, or I talk to my next door neighbour about it, or I see a priest. These kinds of things, mostly reflecting a willingness to seek help from other people, as a result of which I got a seek help score. But there was another score which came from, I turn in on myself. I take alcohol, or I might overdose on tablets, these sorts of things, reflecting an inability to seek help outside oneself and a tendency to turn in. And I called that the turn in score. And people who had had a lot of separations, instead of turning to others for help when they got to the end of their tether, would turn in on themselves, and they were statistically more likely to answer yes to the question, might you take an overdose or otherwise harm yourself? So it seems to be a possible risk factor for attempted suicide. Following bereavement, these people had an increased tendency to cling, high levels of anxiety and panic, and a tendency to rely on alcohol or medications more than the rest of the sample. So again, one can see how separations really confirm Bowlby's findings and beliefs about the dangers of separation, and also may contribute to reactions to a major separation by bereavement in adult life. But fear is a dominant feature in all that. Mary Ainsworth was a trainee of John Bowlby who worked at the Tabby for a while, then went off and did some studies of mother-child attachments in Uganda, and finally went back to America, where she developed the strange situation test. The strange situation test is a means of measuring patterns of attachment between mothers and small children. It was originally developed for mother-child dyads at about the age of 20 months to 2 years, who would be brought into a strange situation, which was actually a small room with a chair and a few toys in it, and a one-way vision screen through which the psychologists could make their observations. The classical model was that mother and child, where mother was instructed to stay with the child for 5 minutes, to leave the room for 2 minutes, and then to come back for a further 5. So the whole experiment took 12 minutes. And during that 12-minute period, the psychologists were making observations on the mother and the child's behavior. And as a result of this, she produced a classification of attachment, patterns of attachment. The first thing she did was to distinguish between what she called secure attachment and insecure attachment. I think before Ainsworth's work, we all knew that children who were rejected were at some psychiatric risk. If your mother didn't love you, you were in trouble. But if your mother loved you, that was all right somehow. And I think it didn't go much beyond that. I think what Mary Ainsworth, and Mary Main for that matter, demonstrated very clearly is there's more to it than that. You can love your child very much and still create problems for them. The securely attached babies, mother and child would come into the room. The child would usually stay close to mother at first, but already by the end of the first 5 minutes, she'd probably have picked up a toy or two and started playing. When mother left the room, it might look a little bit disturbed, sometimes whimpered a bit, but not greatly. When she came back into the room, the child would immediately stop whatever it was doing, put up its hands, mother would pick the baby up, give it a cuddle. Baby sometimes cried at this point, but within the next 5 minutes it was already wriggling to get down and play with the toys again. Now, these were babies who had mothers who were themselves reasonably secure, who gave out a message to these children that was saying, yeah, I'm here for you, you're all right, and sensitively responsive to the child's needs to play or to stay close to, in a sense, interacting with the baby in a way that both protected the child when necessary, but also reassured the child that it was safe enough to explore and play and do the things that children need if they're to develop any kind of self-confidence and independence. What about the insecure babies? Well, the first one, the anxious ambivalent group, these did not like this strange situation at all. They were inclined to stay very close to mother when she was in the room. When she left the room, they cried their eyes out. And when she came back into the room, they often went up and hit her. There was a lot of anger in their cry. Mothers can always tell the difference between a frightened baby and a frightened, angry baby. And these were frightened, angry babies. If the mother lifted them onto her lap, they were still sort of wriggling, and the crying would go on for the whole of the next 5 minutes. So it was quite clear that these were quite distressed babies. Now, when they looked more closely at the mothers, they found that these, on the whole, were mothers who were themselves pretty insecure. They were somehow giving out a message to these kids that you won't survive if you don't stay close to mum. They were intolerant of the child's bids for independence. If the child started playing, they'd want to join in and control the child. They tended to be rather controlling mothers. They were not sensitively responsive to their children. They were more anxiously controlling than sensitively playing. The avoidant group, well, they were quite different. When Ainsworth first observed them, she called them detached, because they didn't seem to give a damn. When they came into this strange room, they would walk away from mum, they'd often start playing. When she left the room, they didn't seem to take much notice. When she came back into the room, they'd sometimes move further away from her. Sometimes they'd come towards her and then go back again, but mostly they just didn't seem to be much thrown by this. It was only later, when they started doing physiological measures of these babies, that they discovered that when mother left the room, these babies' heart rates went shooting up just as high as the babies who were crying their eyes out in the anxious ambivalent group. Something was going on under the surface here. And it's clear that these were babies who had mothers who couldn't stand being clung to. They had the mothers who punished them for crying, who couldn't stand what Bowlby called attachment behaviour. And already by 20 months of age, they'd learned to inhibit their tendency to cling, their tendencies to cry, and all the things that Bowlby had recognised as part of the attachment pattern. They were not detached. They certainly knew what was going on and were affected by separation from mother. And indeed, later studies have shown, for instance, that when these kids go to school or nursery school, if they were truly avoidant, they'd sit at the back of the class. If they were the clingers the anxious ambivalent group sit right in the front, as close to the teacher as they can get. The avoidant groups sit halfway back, out of reach, but not so far away that they begin to get anxious. You follow me? I'm trying to bring home the fact that avoidants are not indifferent. They're sensitively aware to what's going on in the relationship with this other person. It's just that they're not showing it. The disorganized, disoriented group in the initial studies didn't fit very neatly with these new categories that Ainsworth was discovering. She called them atypicals. Sometimes when mother came into the room, they'd run towards her and then run away again. Or they might just sit and rock backwards and forwards. They didn't fit neatly with the models that she'd been developed. She called them atypicals and forgot about them. And it was only years later, months and years later, when they followed up all these kids, and they discovered that this last group were more disturbed than any of the others, that Mary Main, who was one of Ainsworth's students, came back and re-interviewed all the mothers to find out what on earth was going on with this group. And she found out something very interesting. She discovered that, almost without exception, these mothers, at the time when this baby was born, were under enormous stress. They'd either suffered a major loss in their lives, or they were dealing with a difficult husband, or all sorts of reasons why their own needs for emotional support were so great that they weren't really able to respond sensitively to their children at all. They would sometimes, quite unpredictably, be very over-anxious and over-solicitous to the child, and other times totally ignoring its needs, and so preoccupied with their own feelings that they were unable to respond. And sometimes they would even invert the parenting situation where the baby got the idea that he had to look after mother. This sort of pattern, which seemed to be particularly dangerous. Now, when you think about it, the securely attached group had learned ways of living with this mother in ways that enabled them to become reasonably autonomous. They knew they were safe. They behaved reasonably confident and securely. Anxious ambivalent group had learned a strategy for coping with this mother by staying close. The avoidant group had a strategy for coping with this mother by keeping their distance. The disorganized, disoriented group had no such strategy. Their mother's problem has nothing to do with them. There wasn't anything they could do about it. They fulfilled what Seligman called the learned helplessness situation. And people who have been studying depression have recognized the extent to which negative cognitions, ideas that whatever happens, you're helpless, there's nothing you can do about it. This idea of helplessness is something which is one of the factors contributing greatly to the danger of depression in later life, in fact, at all periods. And the whole cognitive theory of depression and the treatment of depression with CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, rests on this idea of helping people to become empowered, helping them to recognize the illogicality of their negative cognitions, their negative thoughts about themselves and the world, helping them in systematic ways gradually to overcome feelings of helplessness, which fits very well with the findings in Ainsworth's research. Just to sum up, this is my own model. I see self-trust and trust in others as being perhaps the two most important things that we learn from our parents in the course of childhood. The securely attached, on the whole, develop a reasonable degree of self-trust and other trust. The anxious ambivalent group develop a measure of trust in the other person, but very little trust in themselves. The avoidant group learn to stand on their own 2 feet from an early age, but have very little trust in others. Insofar as they relate to others, it's often in a rather controlling kind of a way. The disorganized group have the sort of double whammy of very little trust in themselves and very little trust in others. Now, I've spent some time on this. What's it got to do with bereavement? Okay. My own research was very much centered on testing out whether these patterns of attachment could be identified in adult life using a retrospective attachment questionnaire, which I developed, and the extent to which it might affect relationships in childhood, adult life, and following bereavement, because these were bereaved psychiatric patients. I also had a control group of bereaved non-psychiatric patients, and I had another comparison group of non-bereaved psychiatric patients who I was able to compare them with. And I don't have time to do more than just highlight some of the main findings from that study, which all appear in the book. The statistics are all in the appendices at the end. The rest of the book is quite readable. Parenting, I asked 30 questions about mother and the same 30 about father, and 3 extra about the family as a whole, focusing on the kinds of things that I mentioned. I asked questions about childhood, again, focusing on the sort of problems that were likely to arise. Adulthood, particularly focusing on any relationships and problems relating to relationships and losses in adult life. I asked 15 questions about coping strategies, particularly focusing on the end of tether score that I mentioned just now, and 15 questions on symptoms, and used fairly sophisticated multivariate analyses, which I don't have time to go into, to analyze all of this stuff. Parenting scores including measures of insensitivity, overprotection, depression and psychiatric problems, which correlated quite highly together, so I lumped them all together. Separations I mentioned. Unusual closeness. Everybody says they were close to their parents, but I was looking out for something a bit more than that, something unusually close. Rejection and violence within the family or with a particular parent. In the child, the childhood vulnerability scores included timidity, aggressiveness, distrust, the Dresden vase, the precious child who everybody adores, but somehow you get given the impression that the world's a dangerous place where you won't survive. Unhappiness score I mentioned, and Bowlby's compulsive caregiver, the one who learned at an early age that they have to look after other people rather than being looked after. When you lump those scores together, you get a measure of insecure attachment. And when I plotted the insecure attachment score against the overall level of current distress in these bereaved psychiatric patients, I found a very high correlation and a straight line graph. Clearly, insecurity of attachment in childhood, as recalled by my patients, was a major factor in contributing to the level of distress which they were experiencing following bereavement in adult life. Now you might think, well, because you had people with low scores on insecure attachment and low scores on current distress, why on earth were they seeking psychiatric help? Now, that's a very interesting question. Some of them had post-traumatic stress disorder. Some of them had this group tended to have a very traumatic types of bereavement, many of them. Some of them had reasonably secure attachments in childhood, but later in life had some pretty stormy relationships. But for all sorts of reasons, they were still seeking psychiatric help. And I'll say a bit more about them if I get time. Referring to the insecure attachment score, this predicted marital disharmony. These are correlation coefficients, and the continuous lines indicate 0.01 level of significance. So you can see that all of these are significant correlations. Insecure attachments predicted marital disharmony, problematic coping, and the overall distress score. It's quite interesting that the correlation, there's a direct correlation between overall distress and insecure attachment, was actually higher than the correlation with marital disharmony, and through that with overall distress. So what that seems to imply is that the overall distress score was not entirely caused by the marital disharmony. There was more to it than that. This was more to do with overall insecurity, if you're going to give a generalization for it.